Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to go ahead and start getting our hands dirty with S3, past all the boring theory stuff. As always, the best way to learn something about AWS is to go ahead and get your hands dirty. So let's log into the AWS console.
Okay, so here I am in the AWS console. Now, notice our region is Northern Virginia. If we go over to services, you'll find our storage is S3 is under storage. So go ahead and click in there. And notice our region has now changed to global. So S3 does not require a region selection. So S3 is a global service. And we're going to find that out very quickly because when we create buckets, it creates a unique DNS name or web address name. So our bucket names need to be unique. So if you tried to register the bucket test bucket, it's gone. Somebody's probably took that in 2008 or 2009. So you will need to create unique bucket names. Now we can see in here that I don't have any buckets. So let's go ahead and create our first bucket. And we put our bucket name in here. So I'm going to do Ryan and Faye. Faye's my co-presenter for AWS this week. And some of the other courses, and I'm just going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Going to put that into the Northern Virginia region. Here we can copy our settings from existing buckets. I don't need to do that because I don't have any existing buckets. And here you can see it says bucket settings for block public access. So by default, when we create our buckets, all the files we put into that bucket cannot be accessible by the public. And it used to kind of be the other way around. People used to be able to put stuff in S3 and they just make one tiny mistake on the UI and that bucket would suddenly become publicly accessible. And I am talking like over a decade ago. And then they get angry at Amazon because all of a sudden all their files that they thought were private were suddenly public. Now Amazon have gone to great lengths to make sure that that doesn't happen. They block everything by default. So you don't need to worry about the security of your files if you just use the default settings. So by default, nobody can access any of the files that you put in your public buckets or in your buckets unless you make them public. And we'll look at how we do that a little bit later on. Likewise, we've got versioning. You can have version control on your files in your bucket, and we'll look at how to do that later on as well. We're not going to do that now. In here, we can have our tags. So for example, we could say which department that this bucket belongs to. And maybe this is our human resources department that owns this bucket. So this is where we're going to store everyone's pay slips, for example, or any kind of confidential information on employees. In here, default encryption, server-side encryption. So is this encrypted on Amazon's side, yes or no? It's always a good idea to enable server-side encryption by default. I'm not going to, I'm just going to leave it as the default settings. And that is it. Let's go ahead and create our bucket. And it's created it in less than a second, essentially. So you can see our bucket in here. So let's go into our bucket. So this is the overview of our bucket. And then we've got these different tabs. So we've got objects, properties, permissions, metrics, management, access points, etc. And in here, we've got our objects. So our objects are simply the files that we're going to put into our bucket. So let's go ahead and upload some objects. In here, you've got the upload files and folders option. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add files. And what I'm going to do is just add these two files. So picture of me and Faye at reInvent and then the rest of the Cloud Guru team at reInvent. I'm going to go ahead and hit open. Then I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to go ahead and hit upload. And so that is now uploading my files, and you'll be able to see here it says uploaded succeeded, view files details below. And you can see our files in here. Then once you've done that, you can go and hit exit, and then you'll be able to see your files in your bucket here. So if we have a quick look at, let's say, Ryan and Faye, and if you click on the file name, you'll be able to go into this individual object, and you can see all the object overview in here. And note the object URL. Now, this is a publicly accessible URL, and if I was to click on it, we're going to get the following XML script, and it basically says error. The code is access denied, the message is access denied, the request ID is that, and the host ID is that. So essentially, we can't access this file because we do not have the permissions to do so. So if we just go back, so back in the file, if we scroll down, we can have a look at some other properties of it. So we can see the management configurations, our bucket properties. We can enable versioning, which we'll do a little bit later on. We've got different things like object lock, This will basically lock the object from being deleted or overwritten, but we don't want to do that just yet. In here, we've got our storage class. So we can actually go in and edit our object storage class. And right now it's in standard, but we could change this over to one zone infrequently accessed storage. And this is our cheapest storage available. We can even move it to reduce redundancy, intelligent tiering, standard infrequently accessed, whatever. And you can do this on both an object and a bucket level. So when you do it on an object level, it's just being done to the files. If you're doing it on a bucket level, then it's just being it's done to every object within that bucket. So let's go back and scroll down. Here we've got our server-side encryption. We can go ahead and turn that on if we want. We've also got our access control lists. We've got our tags, so we can tag our objects individually as well. And that's about it. What we're going to do now is we're going to go back over to our object, and we're going to try and make this object public. So we're going to try and make it publicly accessible. So you can go to Actions, and we can go over to Make Public, and click on that. When public read access is enabled and not blocked by block public access settings, anyone in the world can access the specified objects. So right now, public access is blocked because our block public access settings are turned on for this bucket. So if I go ahead and hit Make Public, we're going to get this error message. It's just going to say, well, we can't do that because everything in this bucket is blocked. Let's go ahead and exit. So now back in our bucket. So how do we remove block public access? How do we remove that setting? Well, of course, it's a permission. So we need to go into our permissions and we can go ahead and hit Edit. And then all you want to do is untick this, and that will basically allow you to make objects in your bucket public. So let's go ahead and hit Save, and then it's going to ask us to type confirm in here. And so we're going to go ahead and hit confirm, and that has now been saved. And if we go back to S3, we can see that here's the name of our bucket, and here is the access level, and it says objects can be public. So things can be public in this bucket. So let's go ahead and try and make this image public now. So we'll go over to Actions, and we'll go Make Public. And then what we'll do is we'll just hit Make Public. Now you'll see this time it's worked. We have successfully allowed this object to become public. So if we just exit out of it, and if we click in here, and just click on the name of the object, and you'll be able to click on the object URL. That will now load that object. So it is now loading it, and I can send that URL to anyone in the world, and they will then be able to essentially go in and view this object anywhere in the world. This is Faye and I at AWS Summit New York. I actually thought it was reInvent, but it's clearly not. It's at the AWS Summit in New York. So we go back, and if we go back over to our object now, if we just go back to permissions, we can now also see that block public access is turned off for all of them. Now we've only made that one object public. So if we were to go back to our objects by clicking in here and going to reInvent, for example, and then clicking on this URL, even though we've made the bucket publicly accessible, we haven't made this object public. So that's the next thing that we are going to go ahead and do. So all we need to do is just go back to our bucket, click in here, and go over to our actions, and we're just going to scroll down and hit Make Public. Go ahead and make that public, and then go ahead and exit, and then we'll be able to click in here, and we'll be able to click on that URL, and there we are at reInvent. This is a replay, which is the party after reInvent. So at the end of reInvent, they always have a big after party, and here's some of the A Cloud Guru team.
So what are my exam tips? Well, as you know, bucket names share common namespace. So you cannot have the same bucket name as someone else. You cannot get Test Bucket or A Cloud Guru. So make sure you choose a name that's unique to you. When you view your buckets, you view them globally, but you can have buckets in individual regions. So we saw that we had a global view of S3, but when we actually create our buckets, they're created in individual regions. You can actually replicate the contents of one bucket to another bucket automatically using cross-region replication. So we have our bucket in Northern Virginia. We can actually replicate the contents of that bucket over to Sydney. You can change the storage class and encryption of your objects on the fly. And just remember the different storage classes. So we have S3 standard, S3 infrequently access, S3 one zone IA. We then have S3 intelligent tiering. We then have S3 glacier, and then S3 glacier deep archive. So those are the 6 different storage classes available to your objects using S3. And then finally, we looked at transfer acceleration. So if we've got our users all around the world and they want to upload a file, a large file to our bucket in London, what they can do is upload it to an edge location, and then those edge locations use the Amazon backbone networks to bring it into London, and it can be a hell of a lot quicker. It really just depends on network latency and where it is you're uploading your files to. And my final exam tip for S3 is how to restrict bucket access, or even how to control permissions on buckets. And there's 3 different ways to do this. The first is using a bucket policy, and this is going to apply across the entire bucket. The other way we can restrict bucket access or grant object access is using object policies. And rather than applying this across an entire bucket, these are actually applied to individual files within your bucket. And then finally, we can use IAM policies to users and groups within your AWS account to control bucket access. So maybe you want your HR department to be able to access the HR bucket, but you don't want the finance teams or the sales and marketing teams to be able to read those confidential informations. So you can use identity access management policies, applying them to individual users or to groups which contain individual users, and then they would be able to access that bucket or not, depending on the policies that you define. So please remember those 3 going into your exam.